The silence in the cramped room felt heavy, a weight that pressed gently against your chest before the weak sun could even brush the grimy window pane. The faint glow cast pale shadows over cracked stone walls, where years of smoke and grime clung stubbornly, refusing to be washed away. You woke on a rough straw mattress, its prickly surface digging into your skin like a reminder of the day ahead. The air hung thick with stale ale and burnt wood, a scent that settled deep into the damp earth beneath your feet. Outside, the muffled din of voices and clinking mugs floated upward, the endless hum of a medieval inn's ceaseless routine. Your fingers grazed over splintered wood as you rose, knees stiff and body slow from sleep. The coarse fabric of your tunic crept uncomfortably against your skin, each rough thread a small rebellion against modern softness. If running out of phone battery today sends you into a panic, imagine how desperate a dwindling fire was here. A final ember fading into darkness, sealing in cold, hunger, and uncertainty. No chargers, just breaths held tight. The inn breathed around you, alive with busy monotony. The innkeeper's broom scraped tirelessly over the packed earth floor, scraping away yesterday's ashes as distant bleats from tethered livestock punctuated the steady rhythm. From below, the smell of sourdough mingled awkwardly with unwashed bodies. Bread often stretched with sawdust to fill hungry bellies passing through. Survival was a quiet compromise. You shuffled toward the small, cold chamber pot, the chill biting at your fingers. Outside, smoke curled lazily from the hearth where the innkeeper's hands worked methodically, igniting warmth that would shield from the biting chill for moments to come. The faint hope of heat, a fragile ember amidst an otherwise gray morning. As you prepared for the long day ahead, a brief flicker of camaraderie sparked. The soft laughter around a shared mug, the comfort of human presence in the vast, cold world. For a fleeting moment, the hardships slipped aside like mist. Then a sudden stillness fell. The usual chorus of dogs barking was snatched away, leaving an eerie hush that rippled through the village like a shudder beneath the earth. Neighbors exchanged wary glances across narrow streets, their eyes shadowed with unspoken concern. Something whispered beneath the surface that day, something shifting beyond the steady grind. The monotony cracked. The inn's rhythm, once ceaseless, faltered. Hey, before Morpheus sneaks up on you for good, check quickly if you're still subscribed. Some folks noticed the button disappeared, and I don't want you missing the next bedtime stories. Go ahead and leave a like as soft as a pillow. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? And what time is it there? Your interaction keeps this little calm corner alive. Thanks for being part of it. The silence shattered like brittle glass. From the corner where the innkeeper's broom last scraped yesterday's ashes, a sudden crash echoed, sharp against the damp air that hung thick and stale. Your heart jumped, a creature scrambling beneath ribs. Somewhere beyond the cracked walls, a window rattled in its rickety frame. as if afraid to bear witness. Outside, the village's uneasy stillness cracked further. A faint murmur grew, threading through narrow streets like creeping smoke. Voices low and tense, carrying words half swallowed by the cool morning. Something had unsettled the routine. Tremor beneath the muted murmur of daily survival. You pulled your tunic tighter around your frame. The rough fabric chafed mercilessly, but it was a shield, a barrier against more than the raw chill of the dawn. Every breath tasted of damp earth and the faint sting of burnt wood. The promise of heat from the hearth seemed fragile now, as if the flames themselves feared to break this strange quiet. As you shuffled toward the door, knees barely bending, the first glimpse beyond the window hit your eyes like a splash of cold water. Figures gathered in the muddy street, faces etched with worry and shadows. Men and women, who usually exchanged brief nods or grumbled curses, now watched a point further down the lane with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The sight pinned your gaze. A wooden cart sat abandoned at a cruel angle, one wheel lodged stubbornly in a deep rut, mud clinging like coagulated blood. Nearby, a man lay sprawled on the wet ground, his breath shallow, chest rising and falling like a restless sea. His eyes fluttered open just long enough to catch yours, a flicker of plea or warning. Behind him, the driver's seat was empty. Silence filled the void, where shouts and curses would normally tumble. You felt the weight of all the stories these cracked stones held. Stories of hunger clawing through ribs, of desperation strangled by duty, of lives tangled in a web too thick to unravel. This moment felt different, thicker. Then, a sharp bark sliced the air, raw and sudden. A dog, gaunt and wild, tore from an alley, its teeth bared at shadows only it could see, leaving behind a trail of ragged breath and urgency. You swallowed hard, the dryness scraping your throat. The usual chorus of the village was gone, replaced by something colder, something waiting to settle in. Carefully, your fingers brushed a rough stone near the doorframe. It was cold, unforgiving. You took a shaky step outside. The ground pressed into the soles of your boots. Nothing soft here. Mud mixed with discarded straw and broken leaves. A thread of smoke rose from chimneys, but carried a strange bitterness, as if the hearths were forced to burn something other than wood. Heads turned as you walked. Eyes met yours, fleeting and searching. A woman's voice cracked the quiet, carrying an age-old fear masked by forced courage. They say the plague's back. Your heart knotted tighter. Plague. The word dripped in dread, heavy and final, in a village already weighed by hardship. A man beside her, older than time might willingly admit, coughed harshly into a ragged sleeve. His gaze was glassy, clouded. You recognized the signs, whispers in the dark that leave no room for gentle lies. Behind the circle of watchers, the inn's door swung open with a creak. The innkeeper stepped out, his face ashen, hands clenched like iron bands. He looked at you, not with the usual rough camaraderie, but with something raw, unspoken. You felt the fragile ember of morning hope flicker, as if the hearth itself hesitated to burn any longer. The rhythm broke, the steady hum of survival, shattered by the creeping shadow of a sickness that didn't discriminate. Looking back at the man on the ground, your breath caught again. He coughed once more, a dark spatter staining the muddy earth beneath him. For a moment, time bowed, the cold air thickening with the scent of decay and fear. You stepped closer, then stopped, as the weight of an invisible chain wrapped around your mind. Every instinct screamed to retreat, yet your feet remained rooted. The village was no longer just a place of muddy streets and stale ale. It had become a crucible, a slow burn where every choice could be a flicker or a funeral pyre. Your eyes wandered back to the inn, where a faint plume of smoke now mingled with something acrid and unfamiliar. The walls that once felt like shelter now seemed to lean in, as if watching, waiting. Somewhere deep in the distance, a church bell pealed, its solemn toll a reverberation of impending doom. It echoed through the narrow alleys, carrying with it a warning older than any history etched in stone. You found your hands clenched into fists, nails digging into palms as the truth settled. The quiet day ahead promised anything but peace. And just as a chill wind swept down the lane, you caught sight of a figure moving swiftly at the edge of the smoke, a silhouette too deliberate, too urgent to be merely a bystander. Was it hope, or the herald of worse to come? The answer hid in that shadow, just beyond the light. A breath held tight. The village held its breath, too. And so did you. You stepped back into the street as the wind swept scraps of straw and forgotten leaves across your feet. The bitter scent clung to the cold air, biting your lungs as if the village itself exhaled unease. A thin line of smoke curled from chimneys, but it carried an acrid edge now, less the comforting smell of burning wood, more the bitter sting of something foul hidden beneath the surface. The ragged dog, teeth bared at shadows only it seemed to see, vanished down a narrow alley. Its sudden disappearance only deepened the heavy silence that pressed down on the village's cobblestones, now muddied into a treacherous mess by weeks of rain. The sky, a wash of gray, seemed to sag with the weight of unnamed dread. You glanced down at the man, still, gasping on the ground. His breath came in shallow, ragged pulls, little more than whispers of life. You tried to catch his gaze again, but his eyes fluttered closed, surrendering to a weakness that chilled your bones. The crowd around you shifted, uneasy murmurs threading through the air like threads of smoke, barely visible, but impossible to ignore. A woman's sob broke the murmur. Her face was hidden behind a soiled shawl, but the tears tracked down, sharp and cold as icicles. You pulled your tunic tighter, feeling the rough fabric scrape skin already raw from the chill. In moments like this, the harshness of the world carved its signature into your very flesh. Another cough rasped harshly from the man's direction. A dark stain bloomed grotesquely on his sleeve, seeping through to the earth beneath. You hated to look, but you couldn't turn away. The smell was faint, sour and heavy, but enough to curl your stomach. Someone's whispered voice sliced the thickening gloom. "He needs a doctor." A silence. The word hung in the air like a fragile bird trying to breathe in the storm. Doctors here were miracles, myths handed down like bedtime stories. The closest healer lived miles away, guarded by roads more dangerous than most beasts. Even if one came, would they arrive before the dark claim took hold? That thought, sharp and inevitable, settled in your chest like a stone. Nearby, the innkeeper's hands trembled as he gripped the doorframe. His face, usually weathered but steadfast, now seemed haunted, as if the shadows inside had crept out and wrapped around his soul. For a fleeting moment, your eyes met his. No words passed between you, but the unspoken weight passed heavier than any conversation. The town's usual rhythm, the clink of mugs, the scrape of broom on earth, was gone, replaced by a fragile hush that could shatter with any misstep. You could taste the silence, thick, suffocating. Your gaze drifted behind the gathering crowd, to the narrow streets leading into the deeper village belly. The church bell tolled again, slow and mournful, each resonant clang echoing in the hollow between buildings like a warning. The sound pressed against your ears until it felt part of your blood, a pulse counting down an unknown fate. A small girl, no older than 7 or 8, clutched the sleeve of a tall man, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. Her breath caught sharply when she noticed you looking, as if fearing. The same shadow you carried inside. You knelt, careful not to muddy your worn boots further. The man still lay on the ground, shuddering with each breath. His face was pale, the color of ash, and his fingers twitched like dry twigs in the wind. You reached out slowly, hesitating, as if by touching you might ignite a flame or snuff it out. The briefest flicker of warmth stirred in his eyes, but it was nothing more than a fading echo, a cruel tease. You drew back your hand, the cold bite of the stone beneath your fingers, anchoring you to reality. Voices rose suddenly, sharp and urgent, cutting through the stifling quiet. A group of men emerged from a side street, their faces set hard in grim determination. They carried tools, pitchforks, simple blades, anything that could offer protection, or fight back against the unknown menace creeping into their lives. The crowd parted grudgingly to let them through, but the tension was raw. A taut string stretched dangerously close to snapping. A woman's voice cracked out again, louder this time, laced with a brittle edge. "We can't fight a sickness with swords." Her words hung heavily, but the men answered with grim nods, the reality too stark to deny. Survival here was equal parts courage and stubborn hope, or what passed for hope in desperate times. You took a slow, steadying breath. Every instinct screamed to retreat to the safety of the inn's crumbling walls, to the fragile promise of hearth and shelter. But the unwelcome truth was clear. There was no sanctuary where this darkness had crept. Not here, not anywhere. A sudden noise behind you drew your attention, a soft, almost hesitant shuffle. Turning, you caught sight of the silhouette again, the one you had seen by the smoke earlier. Now closer, it moved with purpose, each step deliberate and measured. The figure's cloak billowed slightly in the breeze, masking most features. But a flicker of steel, something sharp, something designed for defense, caught the pale light and held your gaze. For a heartbeat, the village seemed to hold its breath once more. The warmth you'd glimpsed earlier, those fleeting moments by the hearth, the quiet laughter among strangers, was a fragile thread stretched thin across a gathering storm. And then, as the figure stopped at the edge of the crowd, the silence deepened and settled again, thick and expectant. You felt your heart tighten, caught between the slow, relentless pull of dread and a flicker of something else. A choice, a turning point. The wind shifted, carrying a whisper that barely reached your ears. Who was this shadowed visitor? And would they be salvation, or the herald of the darkness yet to come? The figure hesitated just beyond the crowd's edge, cloak fluttering like a whispered secret in the cold breeze. Your breath hitched, caught somewhere between the thick, smoky air and the faint, nearly forgotten warmth of the hearth left behind in the inn. The village seemed to shrink, its narrow streets folding in on you both, as tension wove through the watchers like a silent thread. Each pair of eyes flicked between the stranger and the fading man on the muddy ground, as though deciding which shadow cracked the fragile quiet. You glanced down, spotting the little girl clutching the tall man's sleeve again, her knuckles white as she pressed close to the pale figure. Her wide eyes traced your movements, shimmering like wet glass amid the dirt and grime. The stranger stepped forward, boots heavy with mud, sending a faint spray of damp earth into the stagnant air. The glint of metal, the edge of a small dagger or a worn blade, caught the weak light, reflecting moments of hope amid the gathering darkness. For a heartbeat, everything seemed to hold its breath. The shuffling crowd, the coughing man, the crackling hearth's last flickering flame. A voice, rough and edged with weary authority, broke the moment. "Who are you?" The figure lowered the hood just enough to reveal a face, framed with tangled hair, streaked with soot and dust. Eyes sharp, calculating, but not unkind. "A friend," came the reply, voice low, careful. You studied the stranger. wondering what kind of friend carries steel in a village too battered and worn for such luxury. The ache in your chest tightened. Friend or foe, the moment demanded attention. Nearby, the innkeeper's ragged hands fisted at his sides as he shuffled closer, glancing warily between the newcomer and his ailing guest. The soft groan of the coughing man punctuated the heavy silence, a desperate rhythm marking time against the slow approach of shadow. "You brought news?" someone asked from the edge of the crowd, voice cracked, flint hard. "A plague has come," the stranger said simply, eyes scanning the worn faces before settling on you for a brief instant, as if searching for something beyond mere recognition. The crowd stiffened. The word hung like a curse, layered in old fear, weaving into fears deeper than hunger or cold. You felt the rough fabric of your tunic chafe once more, a dull itch that mirrored the unsettled skin beneath. A gust of wind snatched at loose straw and dead leaves, swirling them into a brief, trembling dance. The smoke from distant chimneys twisted sharply, carrying an acrid bitterness now unmistakable. Not just burnt wood, but something fouled, as if the fires themselves struggled to breathe. The coughing man convulsed suddenly, shaking like a dry branch tossed in the storm. The dark stain on his sleeve deepened, blooming like a wound refused to heal. The crowd drew back in tight circles, retreating from the heavy scent of decay clinging to him. "Is there no help coming?" you muttered aloud, the question a thread dragged across the frayed nerves of the village. The stranger's gaze darkened. "Help travels slow, and the roads are no longer safe. The sickness moves faster." You swallowed, a dry rasp scraping at your throat. The cold pressed in, unforgiving. The man's breath grew shallower, each exhale a brittle surrender. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward, voice trembling but firm. "We must prepare. Quarantine, isolation, whatever we can. This village is all we have." Murmurs bloomed in agreement, edged with panic. Parents grasped children tighter. Elders closed shutters and barred doors. The echo of the church bells struck again, slow and mournful, a mournful heartbeat spreading through tight-knit homes. You felt the weight notch deeper into your ribs. The inn, once a fragile refuge, now stood like a cracked shell under the uncertain sky. The warmth from the hearth seemed a fragile illusion, darkness licking at its edges. Suddenly, the stranger reached into a worn satchel, pulling out small bundles of dried herbs, sage, lavender, and something more bitter, sharp. They moved with practiced hands, distributing the bundles quietly among the villagers nearest. The scent rose faintly, earthy, pungent, a fragile comfort, like a whispered promise against the unforgiving cold. "Smoke these," the stranger instructed. "Keep the air clean. It won't stop the sickness, but it may slow its breath." A small girl, the same one from earlier, dared a hesitant sniff and smiled, a fragile beam amid the gathering storm. For a brief flicker, hope tangled with dread. The man on the ground coughed once more, a harsh, wet sound that echoed sorrow through the street. His eyes opened weakly again, searching, pleading, then drifted shut, as if a bookmark closing on a crueler chapter. The stranger's gaze locked with yours again, filled with unspoken warnings and a weight of knowing. You will need to decide soon, stay and fight or leave before the shadow fully falls. You felt the chilled breeze curl inward, tugging at your resolve like icy fingers tightening a grip. Behind the stranger, the village pulsed, caught between the flicker of a dying light and the long night creeping in. The harsh murmur of voices shifted as a sudden shout broke out near a side alley. Heads turned, some hands reaching for crude weapons. Tension snapped taut. A dozen pairs of eyes darted to the disturbance, breath held tight. From the dimness emerged another figure. This one hurried, eyes darting wildly, as if pursued. Clutched in their arms was something small and fragile, wrapped in a threadbare shawl. Your heart pounded, a sudden race against unknown tides. The quiet morning had dissolved fully, swallowed by storms both seen and unseen. The stranger glanced toward the newcomer, face shadowed. A faint smile, tight, urgent, played upon their lips, a ghost of defiant hope before the dark. And then, with a sudden surge, the crowd parted once more, and the unknown unfolded in shadows deeper than any smoke. The village held its breath. So did you. The figure moved with quiet purpose, steps muffled on the muddy street as shadows deepened in the gray morning. You barely dared to breathe, every sound swallowed by the thick, uneasy air. The crowd parted reluctantly, their eyes wide and restless, like wary beasts caught between hope and fear. Near the man on the ground, the child clung tightly to the tall stranger's cloak, her tears now mingled with dirt on pale cheeks. That fragile smile she dared earlier faded like a flame sputtering behind rain-streaked glass. The stranger's gaze flicked to you once more, sharp and heavy with meanings you couldn't yet decode. "There's little time," they said, voice low and steady. "This sickness moves like a shadow in the fog, silent, relentless." You swallow the lump in your throat, chest tightening as the faint pulse of the church bell rolled again through narrow streets, a slow, hollow heartbeat, counting down a reckoning yet to come. From the other side of the crowd, murmurs grew into murmurs of rumor, whispers of desperation folding into old superstitions. Some spoke of curses, others pleaded for prayers. But no one offered answers. The village had no shield against the invisible, no magic stronger than cold stone and whispered fears. A sharp breeze tore through the alleyways, stirring loose straw and upending a rickety sign advertising the inn's meager fare. The scent of burnt wood mingled now with something fouler. Rotting leaves crushed beneath urgent footsteps. The heavy stink of sickness settling like poison in damp corners. You took a cautious step closer to the stranger. Their eyes held a flicker of something more than warning, perhaps resolve, or a trace of hope too stubborn to fade. They reached into the satchel, slung low across their shoulder. pulling out a small vial sealed with cracked wax. "This," they said, pressing the vial into your palm, "is a tincture made from willow bark and honey. It won't cure, but it will ease the fever's grip. Buy time." Their nod was brief, but resolute. "You'll need this." The weight of the vial felt impossibly heavy, despite its small size. A fragile talisman against a creeping darkness with no mercy. As you clutched it, your gaze returned to the man lying in the mud, his ragged breaths shallow and spluttering, the dark stain spreading wider across his threadbare sleeve. His eyes fluttered open again, catching yours. A sudden plea flickered there, whispered in a language older than the village itself. For a heartbeat, the world outside that muddy street ceased to exist. A distant shout shattered the tense bubble. From a side street, a group of villagers hurried forward, faces etched with panic and resolve. They carried crude tools, axes, clubs, and between them, a woman held a small bundle swaddled tightly in tattered cloth. The strangers' eyes narrowed. "Another has fallen," they muttered, voice grim. You felt the ground beneath you shift. No longer just a village caught in a sick quiet, but a battleground where every breath might spark a fire or snuff it out. The inn's door creaked open behind you, the innkeeper emerging, his usual gruffness gone, replaced by a brittle tension curling around his shoulders. His eyes caught yours, filled with that raw, wordless message you'd come to understand. This day would break something unfixable. Around you, the crowd tightened, faces pale and lips drawn tight as murmurs turned to cries for a plan, for a prayer, for something, anything to stem the tide. You swallowed the tincture cold and unyielding in your palm, your rough tunic chafing like a reminder of every hard morning before this. The fire in the hearth behind you now seemed a fragile ember, trembling beneath a breath. The child beside the stranger whimpered softly, clutching the cloak like a lifeline. In that ebbing warmth, you saw a flicker of fight, a rejection of the shadow that stretched across the village like a shroud. But then your eyes caught something strange. Near the far edge of the crowd, a figure slipped silently into a narrow alley, unseen by most, but moving with a speed and precision that sent a chill racing down your spine. You turned suddenly, heart hammering, breath caught between hope and dread. Was this new shadow the salvation the village desperately needed, or the harbinger of all that would fall? The wind shifted again, carrying whispers too faint to catch, but heavy with meaning. And in the thickening gloom, the village seemed to hold its breath once more, waiting, watching, trembling between the cruel dusk and whatever dawn might yet come. The stranger's cloak caught the thin wind again, flickering like a candle flame, struggling against a chill draft. You barely noticed the biting cold. Your attention was tethered to the soft shuffle near the alley where the new figure had slipped away. Their movement was too deliberate, too controlled to be casual. The man on the ground coughed, a wet rattling sound that cracked the silence like a whip, and you took an involuntary step forward, driven by a mixture of dread and desperate hope. His eyes flickered open once more, haunted pools searching the gray morning, as if seeking salvation in the faces that circled above him. Around you, voices grew uneasy, murmurs, tinged with growing fear and frustration. The town's fragile cobblestones seemed to shudder beneath the weight of silent grief, and the acrid smoke rising from reluctant hearths no longer offered comfort, but instead promised harsh truths. Your fingers clenched around the vial, pressed into your palm by the stranger, a small, heavy thing that suddenly felt like a talisman in a world slipping further into shadow. You could almost feel the weight of unseen chains tightening around the village's weary bones. In the distance, the church bell tolled once more, its slow peals draping the streets in an elegy that made every breath feel heavier. It was a sound that spoke of endings and uncertain beginnings. From the depth of the murmur, a harsh scrape echoed as a man pushed through the crowd, his face pale and eyes gleaming with desperate purpose. He clutched a small bundle wrapped in tattered cloth, fragile and trembling. The soft cry of a child seeped from it, a quiet thread of life in a tapestry fraying fast at the edges. The stranger's gaze locked on the newcomer, narrowing slightly. Their lips pressed into a thin line, shadowed beneath tangled hair. A flicker of something urgent and resolute shot through them, the spark of someone who had seen the thin knife edge between hope and despair too many times to ignore. You felt the heavy silence rip as the crowd seemed to hold its collective breath. The embers of warmth that had flickered in your chest dimmed, replaced by something colder and more urgent. The village no longer felt like a place holding on to fragile routines. It had become a stage for voices converging, where survival demanded every ounce of will. The child's wail, soft and fierce, cut through the tension and drew a wave of murmurs that rippled like wind across dried leaves. The woman holding the bundle pressed a finger to her lips, her eyes wide and haunted yet resolute. In that moment, she was both mother and sentinel, guarding the last flicker of fragile life amid the encroaching darkness. Your gaze flicked upward to the stranger once more. They reached into their satchel again, pulling out a frayed cloth and an odd mixture of powders and herbs tied in little bundles. The scent rose faintly, sharp and pungent, an ancient promise against decay, a whispered rebellion against the sickness tightening its grip. "Keep this close," the stranger said softly, voice rough but steady. "Burn the herbs. Smoke like this won't stop the plague, but it can confuse it, slow its breath when the air tastes thick with death." Your eyes lingered on the stranger's face, hard, weathered, and etched with knowledge few carried these days. They were a guardian against the slow tide rolling through your village, but the weight they bore was visible in every carefully measured word. A sudden cough struck the street again, harsher, more desperate, and you glanced back to the man on the ground. His face was pale as ash, lips cracked, eyes half-lidded with fading strength. You saw the dark stain bloom wider on his sleeve, like a grotesque flower opening to dusk. Behind the crowd, the inn's door creaked wide, and the innkeeper appeared, his face set in lines of grim determination. Gone was his usual stoic grumble. Now he wore a silent plea beneath eyes that shone with unspoken fears. His knuckles whitened on the wooden frame as he watched the unfolding scene, frozen yet ready to act. Your fingers brushed against the rough stone underfoot, catching on chipped edges. The stable scent of earth mixed with a sour tang of something burning, wrong, settled in your nose. The world you had known was tilting, slipping further from the familiar into a place where every breath carved the air thinner. Suddenly, ragged footsteps pounded from the far side of the street. The crowd spun toward the noise, faces twisting in alarm. Another figure rushed into view, a man, gasping, eyes wild with panic, clutching a crude sack. He skidded to a stop next to the stranger, voice harsh, breath ragged. "They're coming faster than we thought," he gasped. "The north road's blocked. No one's getting through." Tension snapped tight among the watchers, a taut thread threatening to unravel. The stranger's jaw clenched. "Then we have no time." A whisper escaped your lips. "What now?" The figure turned slowly toward you, eyes sharp with a weight heavier than any burden you'd carried that day. "Choices," they said. "Fight where you stand, or run while you still can." A soft breeze stirred, tugging at cloaks and shawls, swirling dust and ash into a brief, haunting dance. Above, dark clouds shifted, thin shafts of weak sunlight slicing through momentarily, like a fragile promise amidst the gathering storm. Your breath caught as from the far end of the street, the alley where the silent shadow had vanished moments before, stirred again. A figure stepped into the open, face obscured by a hood, but moving with purpose unmistakable. Eyes met yours. For a heartbeat, a silent understanding passed, an unspoken truth held between strangers standing on the edge of an uncertain war. The village shuddered beneath the weight of that look. Then the figure's hand moved, ever so slightly, revealing a glint, a blade catching the fragile light. And just as the air seemed to still, the quiet was shattered by a sudden, anguished cry that echoed and folded back like a broken prayer. You swallowed hard, the vial pressing cold and heavy in your palm, the choice looming sharp and relentless. The night was coming, but which dawn would follow remained a secret whispered only by shadows. The wind stirred again, carrying with it the sharp scent of damp earth and smoldering herbs. The crowd's uneasy murmurs wove through the stale morning air like a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point. You felt their eyes pressed against you, some hopeful, others haunted, and somewhere beneath it all, the dull throb of fear pulsed like a slow drumbeat in your chest. The coughing man's breaths came ragged and shallow. His pale face was drawn tight over sharp bones. Lips cracked and stained with dark flecks that left a bitter promise on the muddy ground. He looked briefly toward the stranger before you, pleading silently with eyes that had already seen too much. The faintest flicker of warmth surged in your gut before retreating like a candle guttering in a draught. Around you, the village held its collective breath. The scattered smoke rising from chimneys curled upward with a reluctant grace, but the bitterness that laced the air no longer promised the comfort of wood fires. It whispered of a deeper rot, a sickness creeping unseen like shadows beneath the skin. A weary woman stepped forward, clutching a gnarled sack tied tight against her chest. Her hands trembled, but her voice, when she finally broke the silence, was steady, carved from years of hard mornings and harder losses. "If the plague is here," she said, eyes searching faces, "then we have no choice but to seal ourselves away. Lock the doors, burn what must be burned, but do not let fear unravel what's left." Murmurs ran like cold water through the crowd. Parents drew children close. Elders hurried to shutter windows. Wives exchanged grim looks, fear tempered by stubborn, bleeding hope. The town's slow rhythm had shattered, replaced by a fragile resolve that danced on the edge of panic. You tucked the vial of tincture deeper into your rough tunic, the fabric scratching against your skin like a reminder of reality's bitter edge. Its weight was small but profound, a talisman against the growing darkness, winding its way through narrow streets and broken homes. The stranger shifted beside you, cloak billowing briefly, like a fallen leaf caught in a breeze. They knelt with deliberate care beside the coughing man, speaking in low tones that disappeared into the turn of the wind. You caught fragments, phrases of healing herbs and warding charms, words that carried an ancient, stubborn defiance. Then, above the murmurs, the church bell tolled again, its mournful echo stretching long and low across the village like a sorrowful breath. It was a solemn rhythm, each peal a slow heartbeat, marking time until the inevitable unfolded. Near the edge of the crowd, eyes darted to a figure emerging cautiously from a dim alley. Their movements were sharp, controlled, too careful to be merely passing through. You recognized that silent shadow from before, whose presence had unsettled the morning like a secret pulse beneath the skin. Now their face was half hidden beneath a hood, but their gaze was clear and steady, locking onto you in a moment that stretched thin and taut between the beat of your own heart. A shiver traced along your spine, not from cold, but from the weight of unspoken decisions gathering like storm clouds overhead. The stranger glanced toward this newcomer, their jaw tightening. Both figures carried tension like a second skin, shadows wrapped around them as tightly as the thick fabric of their cloaks. Suddenly, a harsh cry split the fragile quiet. The child, wrapped in tattered cloth, whimpered again, pulling at the woman holding her, as if fearing the chill of the expanding darkness. Men near the front gripped crude weapons, sticks, rusty blades, whatever could be wielded in desperation. Yet their eyes betrayed the bare truth. None felt prepared to strike the invisible enemy closing in. You stepped closer to the man on the ground, kneeling cautiously. His breaths rattled like dry twigs, each one fracturing the silence anew. His hand twitched once, reaching feebly toward you before falling still again. The dark stains spreading across his sleeve bloomed wider, a cruel, spreading shadow nodding your stomach with dread. The stranger rested a hand briefly on the man's shoulder before rising, eyes meeting yours again with an urgency that demanded attention. "This is no common sickness," they said quietly, voice rough but resolute. "It moves fast, and it does not discriminate." A cold wind swept through the crowd, scattering ash and leaves in a swirling dance around your boots. The remnants of burning herbs caught faintly on the breeze, a fleeting promise against the suffocating weight of decay, hanging low over cobblestones slick with mud and old sorrows. Behind you, the inn's door groaned as the innkeeper stepped into view once more. His usual gruff demeanor was etched now with a raw, silent plea. He looked around the gathering with eyes that sought answers in the faces of those too weary for promises. Eyes that knew the fragile line between hope and despair. "Will anyone come?" you whispered to no one and everyone at once. The stranger's gaze darkened. Help comes slow, if at all. Roads are blocked, and fear moves faster than foot or horse. We prepare for what we can, or we flee before it's too late. Murmurs rippled again, unease sharpening to brittle panic as the villagers weighed their dwindling options. You glanced toward the narrow alley where the hooded figure now stood still, watching the scene like a sentinel on the edge of a war. A glint of metal caught the sun, faint, quick, like a silent promise or a whispered threat. The church bell tolled once more, slow and insistent. Its final peal echoed through the village as if sounding a call to arms or mourning a dying light. And just as the wind swirled a loose scrap of straw to your feet, the child's frightened cry pierced the morning anew. Eyes locked, breath caught, the moment froze, poised on the razor's edge between light and shadow. The shadowed figure stepped forward. Time thinned. The village waited. And so did you. The figure stepped forward through the thinning crowd, boots sinking slightly into the softened earth. Each movement was precise, measured, like the careful brushstrokes of a painter reluctant to spoil their canvas. The village held breath tight in its chest, seemed to cling to the newcomer's every step, hope and fear woven tightly as one. Your gaze flicked from the stranger's sharp eyes to the battered man still lying in the mud. His breathing had slowed, shallow gasps barely stirring the morning air. The dark stain on his sleeve bloomed wider, a grotesque shadow spreading against the pale fabric, as if his body was giving in to silent command. The child, pressed to the stranger's side, whimpered softly, clutching at the coarse cloak like it was a lifeline braided from desperation and fading warmth. For a moment, that small sound fractured the crushing silence, a whisper of fragile life caught in the teeth of something monstrous. The stranger reached into the satchel once more, fingers deft despite the chill. From within, they pulled a small, crudely carved wooden whistle and pressed it to trembling lips. A mournful, haunting tone slicked into the damp air, curling through the alleys and crackling hearth smoke like a faint prayer. Eyes lifted, murmurs swelled into whispers, and then a sudden stir. From the far edges of the crowd, figures emerged from doorways and shadowed nooks, drawn by the call. Some moved with urgency, others hesitated, weighed down by dread or disbelief. But all were pulled forward, as if summoned by something older than the village itself. The man on the ground coughed once more, harsh and rattling, a sound that seemed to scrape the lining of the world clean, in a way that left your throat raw. His gaze flickered toward the approaching shapes, recognition and fear mingling in a silent exchange. The weight of that look settled in your gut. This was no simple sickness. This was a reckoning. The stranger's voice broke the murmurs, low but firm. "They're coming," they said, eyes scanning the faces crowding the street. "Soon, the village will be surrounded. We have little time." A flicker of movement caught your eye near the alley where the silent shadow had slipped away earlier. That figure appeared again, now closer, their cloak catching the gray light, while their footsteps disappeared softly over the broken cobblestones. They paused, just long enough to meet your gaze, a moment thick with unspoken tensions, a silent pact hanging fragile between you both. The church bell tolled again, slow and mournful, each peal dripping through the village like blood falling on stone. It carved a rhythm, the heartbeat of a place on the brink. You could feel it, threading through the ragged crowd, into the rough fabric of your tunic, pulling every breath taut with unanswered questions. The stranger moved with deliberate steps toward the inn, turning briefly to gesture with the whistle again. From doorways, shutters, and behind trembling hands, More villagers spilled out, faces pale under the wan light, some clutching crude weapons, others cowering beside children. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of smoke, earth, and that faint bitterness of rot lurking undetected. You tucked the vial deeper into your rough tunic, fingertips brushing the cold glass. It was a small thing, but heavy with meaning. A fragile shield against a shadow spreading faster than the dawn. The coughing man's breath hitched suddenly, jagged and desperate. His body convulsed lightly, each spasm a cruel punctuation in the quiet street. The crowd took a cautious step back, eyes wide with unshed tears or frozen in silent horror. The stranger knelt once more, pressing a bundle of herbs to the man's lips. The pungent scent curled upward, a lifeline made of earth itself, a whispered defiance amidst the encroaching darkness. Around you, the village held a fragile equilibrium, threads of hope woven tight against the looming unraveling. Then, without warning, a distant cry shredded the air, sharp and terrified, sending a ripple of panic through the crowd. Heads snapped toward a narrow lane, where the village's edge met shadowed woodland. From the darkness, another figure burst forth, head bowed, movements frantic. Cradled in their arms was a limp shape wrapped in ragged cloth, a faint tremor betraying the fragile breath within. You stepped forward, heart pounding a staccato rhythm against the cold stone beneath your boots. The stranger rose beside you, cloak whispering across the wet earth, their eyes locked on the arriving figure, face shadowed but jaw clenched. A fleeting shadow of a smile, a hint of grim resolve, passed over their lips. "Another's fallen," they said quietly, "and others will follow." The crowd tightened instinctively, whispers rising into murmurs thick with fear and determination. Mothers pulled children close. Men gripped weapons with white-knuckled hands. The looming weight of inevitability pressed in like the chill settling deep in your bones. The stray wind lifted loose straw and dead leaves, scattering flickering ash from reluctant hearths. Smoke rose in thin gray tendrils, curling against the cold sky as if desperate for warmth denied. Your eyes strayed again to the silent shadow, now unmistakably stepping forth from the dark. Cloaked and hooded, but eyes shining with sharp clarity, they moved steadily toward the murmur of uncertain hearts. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The wet earth beneath your feet held its breath. The sick man's ragged breaths grew faint. The bell's toll floated slow and steady, a dirge for the fading light. The shadowed figure pulled back their hood, not to reveal a familiar face, but to bear the weight of intent etched in weary lines and fierce determination. Their hand reached, bare and unflinching, to the small hilt at their side. The blade shimmered, catching the bleak light as a single, silent promise. And just as the crowd's whispers crescendoed into a tense hush, a voice fractured the mounting silence, a daring cry, a question inked with defiance. your breath caught somewhere between hope and ruin. The night was falling. The choice, now, hung poised like a blade over the fragile throat of this village's fate. The fragile thread of tension that had wound tight around the village's throat began to loosen ever so slightly. The shadowed figure stepped forward from the gathering, breaking the spell of silence that had held every breath captive. Their eyes, sharp despite the grime and wear, met yours with a quiet determination, unspoken promise to face what the dark morning had summoned. The coughing man, his breath a rasping whisper of life still clinging on, lay a little more still now. The spreading stain on his sleeve seemed less like a wild, cruel bloom, and more like a final sigh settling upon something inevitably ending. You bent closer, feeling the rough earth and the faint pulse of retreating life beneath your palm. His eyes opened once, half-glazed, full of a distance that even your presence couldn't bridge. But within that fleeting gaze was a quiet acceptance. No heroics awaited here, only the slow surrender to forces far older than anyone in the village dared name aloud. Around you, the crowd's murmurs gave way to a tempered hush, weighted with a bittersweet understanding. The church bell tolled again, each slow peal echoing like a heartbeat, counting down not only death, but the fragile promise of what might come after. The sky had begun to shift, patches of muted gold breaking through the gray as the sun rose higher, turning the damp stones and muddy streets to faint warmth. The air, still heavy, carried less of the acrid taste of decay and more of a fragile hope, like the first tentative breath after a storm's passing. The stranger knelt beside the coughing man, laying a steady hand on his shoulder. Their voice was low, barely a murmur, yet it cut through the silence like a balm. He is not forgotten. They looked up at you then, face softened by years of hardship, but bearing a spark that refused to dim. This sickness took much, but it has not claimed the spirit of this place. The villagers shifted, some stepping closer, their faces marked by sorrow, but also by resolve. The child, still clutching the stranger's cloak, finally allowed herself the small smile, fragile but genuine. If the weight pressing on the village had, for a moment, lifted enough to show light beneath, a woman reached out carefully, brushing a trembling hand over the man's forehead, whispering a prayer older than the stones beneath their feet. Outside, the stray dog reappeared, slower now, its wild eyes softened. It nosed at the ground, pushing aside a loose strand of straw, before settling quietly at the edge of the crowd. A silent witness to days carved deeply in grief and endurance. Sometimes, survival was about small, quiet moments like this. A breath shared between lives caught in the unyielding grasp of history. The village, granite and mud and stubborn spirit, held firm in the shifting light. Doors once barred in fear now opened slowly, allowing the fragile warmth of sunlit air to spill into homes long closed against the shadow. Flames flickered anew in hearths, small but steady, casting dancing amber against walls, etched by years of stories, both bitter and sweet. Smoke rose, not with the sharp bite of something burned beyond repair, but soft, steady, and promising life to come. You felt the rough fabric of your tunic no longer as a shield against chill, but as a part of this place's enduring identity. Raw, imperfect, but unyielding, every thread carried the memory of hardship lived and shared. Every worn stitch a reminder of the quiet strength that bent beneath burden, but never broke. The stranger stood at last, drawing a deep breath that seemed to gather all the weight hanging in the air, and then release it gently, with a sigh both weary and hopeful. Their eyes scanned the gathering one final time, settling on you with a look that conveyed both farewell and a beginning. Hope is fragile, they said quietly, but it burns brighter because it is so easily snuffed. Guard it well. You nodded, feeling the silence swell around those words. The village seemed to exhale, a long, slow breath that loosened the grip of dread just enough for a tentative peace to slip in among broken stones and whispered prayers. Step by careful step, the crowd began to disperse, returning to the slow rhythm of survival. Children were lifted into arms. Neighbors exchanged nods heavy with shared understanding, and the inn's door creaked softly as the innkeeper re-entered, his face drawn but no longer shadowed by hopelessness. The rickety broom rested beside the hearth, forgotten for a moment, as the steady hum of life reclaimed its place under weary skies. You lingered a moment longer in the street, sunlight warming the cold stones beneath your boots. The village was still marred by loss, the imprint of the plague visible in the empty house and the hollow eyes. Yet beneath that was a new stitch in the fabric of existence, a stubborn insistence that even after the darkest dawn, the world persisted, that somewhere beyond shadow and sickness, light could touch the earth once more. With that thought echoing gently in your chest, you turned slowly back to the inn, a refuge now less of walls and stone, and more of shared breath and fragile hope. The rough straw mattress waited, not as an enemy, but as a resting place earned through resilience. Outside, the wind whispered softly, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves and a promise ever ancient, ever true. Life goes on. You close the door behind you, the lingering warmth from the hearth settling around your shoulders like a forgotten comfort, newly remembered. The silence was no longer heavy, but full, filled with the quiet heartbeat of a world that, despite everything, had found a way to whisper good night.